Rain traced thin silver threads down the panes of the east-facing window, soft as if the morning itself were trying not to be heard. Phoebe Ashford had always loved the hush of first light, the way the house drew a deep breath before the clatter of trays and voices and opinions began. She sat curled in the window seat of the library, stockinged feet tucked beneath her, a wool shawl looped around her shoulders, and a volume of essays open on her lap, though she had read the same paragraph 3 times without taking it in. Beyond the glass, the lawns dissolved into a grey that toppled into the trees, and somewhere a rook was rehearsing the same irritable notes it always sang to begin the day. The hour tasted of paper and tea and the faint patience of dust, familiar, forgiving things. If she angled her head, she could see the library's reflection float over the rain-laced world, the ranks of dark spines and small gilt titles, the ladder with its polished rungs, the long table where her father used to sit with maps and accounts before the doctors insisted that he learn to be idle. The room was a ship that had ferried her through years when being visible felt dangerous and being useful impossible. Here the sound of her name did not bite. Here nobody told her that 22 was too late for miracles. Footsteps skimmed the runner outside. Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, tapped and entered with the diplomatic energy of a woman who had managed 2 generations of Ashfords without ever once being surprised by them. "Miss Phoebe," she said, voice pitched soft so as not to bruise the morning. "Your mother has rung twice." "I told her I'd seen you in the library, which is true enough, but she'll want you in the drawing-room before the second post." Phoebe slid a ribbon between the pages and closed the book. "Is it the dressmaker or the garden party or—" She let the sentence trail. With her mother it could be all calamities at once. "None of those. Something better and worse than all of them, if you take my meaning." Mrs. Hartley's eye, not unkind, assessed Phoebe's simple blue morning dress and the loose plait that refused to obey pins. "You look neat enough. Your mother will ask for more, but neat is a start." Downstairs, Ravenscroft Manor had already thrown off its hush. A footman hurried past with a tray of tiny sandwiches that the family never seemed to eat, but were required to exist, like the marble bust in the vestibule that nobody could name. The drawing-room smelled faintly of starch and perfume. The fire had been urged into an excellence that made the cheeks heat whether they wished to or not. Lady Victoria Ashford stood in the middle of the room, hands spread like 2 small command flags, directing the opening manoeuvres of the day. To her left, Caroline, 3 years younger, 3 shades lazier in posture, and 3 times more likely to be forgiven for it, sat poised at the harp, with her head bent so that her hair fell like sunlight caught in silk. "There you are," Lady Victoria said, without looking, as if she had conjured her elder daughter by saying so. "At last. Is it quite impossible for you to be within hearing when the bell is rung? No matter. We shall have to manage. Sit, Phoebe. No, stand. Sitting makes that dress look tired. Where is Miss Hartwell?" "She was to bring the invitations and— Caroline, darling, tilt your chin. I can't see your profile, and your profile is the jewel." Caroline glanced up, blue eyes bright with that happy indifference that comes when a person has never learned to wonder whether there is enough love to go around. "Good morning, Phoebes," she sang. Only Caroline called her that, and only when their mother was listening. "Good morning." Phoebe stood, as instructed, under the portrait of their paternal grandmother, who had the expression of a woman who had never sat improperly in any chair and had enjoyed it. Lady Victoria pinched the bridge of her nose, then lowered her hand and remembered to be delighted. "News," she declared. "Excellent, astonishing, triumphal news. The Duke of Westmoreland has returned to town for the season." Phoebe felt the news attach itself to nothing inside her. A duke was a creature from the newspapers, like comets or wars. "Has he?" she said neutrally. "The Duke," Caroline whispered, with the pleased awe of someone presented with a new melody. "Is it true, Mamma? Is he coming to Lady Blackwood's ball? Do say he is. Do!" Lady Victoria's smile sharpened, like a seam stitched tight. "He is on Lady Blackwood's list, and one might assume that if his name can be written on a card, his person can be induced to appear in a ballroom. He has been inconsolable since his wife's death, naturally, but it has been 3 years. A man must live. And men, Phoebe, live very well indeed, with wives who understand how to present them to the world." Her mother did not look at her when she said this. She looked at Caroline, who knew how to smile with 5 different levels of brightness and never once had to practice any of them. "Mrs. Ellison has sent fabrics," Lady Victoria continued. "Ivory and a blue that is almost indecent in its candour, which is to say perfect. Caroline, you will wear the blue, with the Belgian lace. You must look like a promise and a surprise. The Duke is said to dislike very obvious women." Phoebe stood very still and allowed the words to pass over her. She had long ago learned the art of being a steady thing in a room of sudden winds. When she was younger, she had believed she might earn her mother's attention by excellence at Latin or by the quiet miracle of never breaking anything. Then she had learned that attention and love were 2 different currencies, and that her mother was very rich in one and careful with the other. This did not make Lady Victoria cruel. It made her practical. Practicality in a house with faltering accounts and temperamental roofs was its own kind of devotion. Miss Hartwell, the governess whose duties had become a patchwork of everything nobody else wanted to do, entered with an apology balanced on a stack of invitations. "So very sorry, Lady Ashford. The postman was delayed by the rain and—" "Ah, Phoebe, good morning. Still faithful to the library, I see." She smiled, and there was no pity in it, only recognition. Miss Hartwell understood that there are rooms in a house where certain people live and others merely pass. "We were speaking of the Duke," Lady Victoria said, with the casualness of a commander discussing troop movements. "We shall present a united front at Lady Blackwood's. Phoebe, you will attend." Caroline's brows, fine as commas, tilted. "Must Phoebes? It will exhaust her dreadfully. There are to be 3 waltzes in the first hour alone, and you know she—" "Phoebe will attend," Lady Victoria repeated, "and she will look respectable. Not decorative, that would be ridiculous. But respectable. The family is a tapestry. One does not tug out threads simply because they are not gold." Phoebe said, "Of course," though she had meant to say, "I would rather not." And the difference between the 2 sentences made something press against her throat. To avoid choking on it, she crossed to the window and forced her attention to the weather. The rain had become a threadbare drizzle. The great chestnut at the drive's bend shook itself like a dog. "We will require a gown," Miss Hartwell said, brisk and kind. "Green to flatter your eyes, which are entirely wasted inside this house, and a ribbon for your hair that suggests effort without resembling work. You may choose the book to put in your reticule. No more than an inch of spine must show, else they will think you smuggling contraband." Caroline laughed. Honestly, not unkindly. Let her bring a wagon for her books and park it at the side of the room. All the old men will queue for a turn. All the old men, Lady Victoria snapped, have daughters or nieces who will be queuing for the Duke. Phoebe turned back, surprised at the brittle edge in her mother's voice. It was not like Lady Victoria to let ambition sound so naked in a sentence. She preferred it dressed in propriety and peppermints. For a moment, Phoebe saw the girl her mother must once have been, a clever, impoverished beauty at a county assembly, learning to read a room like sheet music and to play it. Later, when the room's temperature had fallen a little and the maps of the day had been drawn, Phoebe escaped to the long corridor that led to the servants' stairs. Here the house's bones showed. The carpet was threadbare and honest. The air smelled of beeswax and onions. Isabel Winters, who had become Caroline's maid at 16 and had learned to bear jewellery and secrets with the same light fingers, was coming up with an armful of wrapped parcels. "Miss Phoebe," she said, brightening, "I was hoping I'd see you. Mrs. Ellison sent the green you like, the one with the brownish cast." "I told Miss Hartwell it made your eyes look like something one ought to apologize to." Phoebe laughed, despite herself. Isabel had a way of setting a thing down outside the door of sadness, then knocking politely and running away. "I will apologize to no one for my eyes," she said, mock grave. "But I am willing to be grateful for new fabric." "Not new," Isabel said cheerfully. "New enough. There's a bit of a snag near the hem that Mrs. Ellison says can be disguised with cleverness. Miss Hartwell possesses that in abundance. You bring the person to put inside the dress, and we shall contrive the rest." In her room, plain, high-ceilinged, with 2 bookcases that had been declared indecent by an aunt, Phoebe sat on the edge of the bed and looked at herself in the mirror without flinching. It was a discipline she practiced, to consider the face she had been allotted without cruelty and without complaint. Chestnut hair that slid out of curls as soon as a back was turned, skin that freckled and refused the moon-pale ideal, a mouth that was perhaps too decisive, eyes of a colour people argued over at dinner. Not a beauty, not an ornament, not a promise to a room full of hungry mothers, but not a stranger to herself either. That had to count for something. She unpinned her plait and let the hair fall, shook it, and wound it again with a more forgiving hand. The small drawer where she kept pins and letters held a new note. She knew because there was always a little lift to paper placed by Belle, as if the letter had been tucked to bed. Phoebe unfolded it. "Miss Ashford," the neat hand read, "your subscription to the Society for the Education of Working Children has been received with thanks. If you have time to draft the pamphlet on hygiene that you mentioned in your last letter, we would be grateful. There will be a meeting next fortnight at the chapel behind St. Bartholomew's, tea and biscuits provided. Enthusiasm mandatory. Yours, etc. Mr. D." Phoebe pressed the paper flat with her palm, warmth rising to her chest. Here was a room she knew how to enter. A room where ideas mattered more than faces, and where a woman's sentence could be allowed to travel to the end without chaperonage. She had written 3 pamphlets already during the winter, which was a kind of dance all its own. Choosing steps that would not tread on anyone's pride, choosing music that would be remembered when the sheet was folded away. The day lengthened. It passed through lunch, soup that could not decide whether to be confident, through a fitting in which Miss Hartwell coaxed the green into something that did not quarrel with Phoebe's shoulders, through an hour at the pianoforte, where Caroline ran scales with the speed of someone counting the coins of her future in her head. When dusk began to dilute the corners, Phoebe went back to the library with a pot of tea that had not been invited anywhere else. She opened Shelley and then drifted into a book of sermons, startling herself by liking them. "Miss Phoebe?" Edmund Blackwood said from the door, and a person could be forgiven for thinking a church bell had spoken. The butler's voice had the steadiness of a man who had held coats at births and funerals and never confused one for the other. "Your mother asks whether you have signed the note to Mrs. Fielding regarding the flowers. She intends roses." "The season will not wait for us to be clever," Phoebe said, "but nor will roses. Tell my mother I will sign presently, and add a line begging for lavender. The house forgets to breathe when it is anxious." "Very good, miss." He stepped in further, saw the books arrayed like small shy guests, and allowed his mouth the smallest kindness. "Do you require more lamp oil?" "Tonight promises to be long." "It promises to be shorter than my mother wishes, and longer than my father can bear," Phoebe said, and then flushed, because sarcasm was an expensive spice, and she had resolved to use less of it. "Forgive me. Yes, please, more lamp oil. And Blackwood. Thank you." "For lamp oil," he teased gently. "For reminding me that the night knows its own business." He withdrew. The rain struck a new tempo on the glass, and then softened, mollified by its own effort. The house did its evening tricks. Doors clicking, fires settling, the faint gossip of footsteps deciding where they wanted to be. Phoebe read until the words stopped behaving, and then leaned her head against the cushion and let herself imagine, for no more than a minute, and with the severity of a judge, what it would be to go to the ball and be neither paraded nor hidden, to be met as if she were an equal mystery, not a solved problem. To be seen, not because a man was bored, but because looking had become the only thing left to do. That was the danger of libraries. They made a person believe such sentences belonged in the world. Morning again, then errands, then fittings, then the educational pamphlet drafted with Miss Hartwell's superior commas, then letters and the dainty fatigue that comes of answering questions nobody has honestly asked. The day of Lady Blackwood's ball arrived with the sky emptied clean and the house strung tight. Dresses appeared from paper cocoons. Caroline practiced walking into rooms without appearing to move at all. Lady Victoria allowed herself exactly one sigh and hid it in her handkerchief. In the small sanctuary of her room, Phoebe stood while Isabel tidied the last unruly loops of hair and fastened the green ribbon Miss Hartwell had chosen. The gown did what it could. It believed in her more than most fabric had. "There," Isabel said, stepping back. "If you were a forest, this is the moment every bird decides to sing." Phoebe smiled at her reflection, because to deny kindness is its own sort of vanity. "You make a person brave, Belle." "Only tidy," Isabel said. "Brave is something you are already." They descended together. The carriage was a box of expectation, upholstered. Lady Victoria issued last-minute stratagems with the breathless clarity of a general. "We will enter left. We will greet Lady Blackwood before approaching the far end. We will avoid the overlit portion near the musicians because it whitens the complexion unkindly. We will not eat anything that can bleed in public." Caroline listened with affectionate impatience, already several hours into the ball in her mind. Sir William patted Phoebe's knee and left his hand there, as if reminding himself of her existence by touch. He smelled faintly of old tobacco and ink, and the pocket mints he had offered her as a child, when she had done something brave that took place entirely inside her. The street flowed with gilt-edged carriages moving in the same direction, a procession of ambitions tarted up as horses. When they reached Lady Blackwood's, the steps sparkled with frost, that would regret itself later. A liveryman set down the stool, and the night unveiled itself. A scent of roses, unseasonal enough to be false. A flurry of laughter. The metallic promise of a chandelier waiting to set everyone's evening to a single bright note. Inside, the ballroom stretched like a held breath. Candles lifted their faces in regimented astonishment. Mirrors admired mirrors and were not ashamed. The orchestra tuned, the strings sounding as if the room had briefly grown a spine. People arranged themselves into constellations, hoping to be navigated. Caroline bloomed at once under the glow, taking up her portion of air with elegant entitlement. Lady Victoria steered them through greetings, leaving little wakes of perfume and certainty. Phoebe's portion, always, was the wall, the space from which one can see without being obliged to glow. She found it without being told. A margin near a window, a reasonable chair, a drink that did not require upkeep. Here elderly ladies congregated with the joy of refugees, grateful to speak as if each sentence were a baked thing that might be shared. They asked her about books, because books found their way into everything in the end, and she answered with care, because talking about books in a ballroom is like lighting a candle in a wind. One must cup it with one's hands and bend close and ask the flame's permission. It would be easy, a person might say later, to pretend that the evening began to transform the instant he entered. But the room had already been changing for hours, dresses loosening, tempers tightening, hopes sweating under ribbons. What his arrival did was not to alter the room, but to focus it. Conversations thinned and then decided to pause. A small sea of silk shifted to face the same shore. Names ran ahead of him. Westmoreland, Montrose, the Duke, like footmen clearing a path through language. Phoebe did not stand. She did not peer. She kept her seat and her book talk, which felt like a kind of protection against catching fire. But she saw him. Of course she saw him. He was tall enough to generate his own perspective in space. Not a beauty, but a fact. A face made by choices rather than by luck. Severity hidden inside a courtesy that did not apologize for existing. His clothes were everything clothes could be when they had never once been asked to be practical. The air altered near him, not because he dragged attention, but because he gave it back. He looked at people as if they were not scenery. She told herself this was merely observation, a skill sharpened by years at the periphery, and returned her attention to the point an elderly baroness was making about the wickedness of modern punctuation. The baroness thumped her cane on the sentence as if to staple it to the floor. Phoebe laughed and agreed, and allowed the corner of her eye to keep working, like a small, faithful dog at a window. Caroline and the Duke met where such people are designed to meet, under the chandelier's most flattering truth. Caroline curtsied. The Duke bowed. Words blossomed and were pruned. Laughter scattered and returned because it liked the lighting. Lady Victoria leaned, almost imperceptibly, in the direction of destiny. And if the Duke's gaze lifted once and moved slowly around the room until it found the corners, if his eyes, in that passing, acknowledged the existence of women who had not been built for ballrooms, that meant nothing. A man may see a window without desiring to leap through it. "Miss Ashford?" The Baroness touched Phoebe's sleeve, retrieving her from her own head. "Do you know Dickens's latest? A shocking vulgarity in places, but I admire any man who so loves the poor he insists on seeing them." "I do," Phoebe said, grateful. "His heart is impatient with dirt he cannot sweep by himself. It makes him useful, and occasionally insufferable. "Quite," said the Baroness, and because the world can sometimes be kind in tiny, efficient ways, she added, "My dear, green is your colour. Why have you been hiding from it all this time?" Later, after the first waltz had wound its silk through the room and taken with it a certain kind of hope that comes from believing oneself to be accidentally the centre, Phoebe rose for lemonade. She navigated the edges, carried by the general current of servants and sensible conversation. The table of refreshments offered its little town of glasses, like crystal houses. She claimed one and turned and found herself returning someone's gaze with the quick, guilty relief of two people surprised into honesty. He stood 3 paces away, no orchestra dramatics, no angels panting. Simply a man aware of himself, surprised into being aware of someone else. He inclined his head in the mild way that pretends it has not altered anything. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice low and precise, a northern edge hidden under London polish. "I believe we share friends among the books." The proper reply was available to her. "Your Grace, you are kind. Yes, the weather is admirable for dancing." And she reached for it, and it broke like thin glass in her hand. What came out instead was careful and true. "Books are greedy," she said. "They will count their friends whether or not the people agree to be counted." A corner of his mouth learned a new shape. "Greedy," he repeated, tasting the word. "Yes. That is the first accurate insult I have heard offered to literature in some time." "It wasn't meant as an insult," Phoebe said, and then realized she had spoken as if she had the right to amend a duke, and felt the lovely, shocking lift in her chest that comes when a person remembers rules and chooses not to bleed for them. It was a confession. Of what? He did not lean closer. He simply managed to be nearer. "That I have not always managed to keep friendship in proportion. The living suffer for it." "And yet," he said, glancing, only glancing, toward the margin of elderly ladies who had claimed her earlier, "the living here look well supplied." "They are generous," Phoebe said. "Generous people make their friends appear abundant." "Then we are both fortunate tonight," he said, and the sentence could have meant nothing more than the politeness it wore. It could have ended there and gone to join all the other sentences that had been spoken in rooms like this, and worked hard without ever shifting a single fate. He could have bowed and taken his lemonade and arranged his evening as a careful man arranges his banknotes. Instead, a small silence opened between them, and he did not hurry to fill it. She did not either. They allowed a measure of honesty to creep in through the music, the way a cat will insist on entering a room and be made welcome by those who deserve it. After a moment he said, "They tell me this room is at its best if you stand there." He nodded to a patch near the far mirror. "One sees the whole, and accidentally oneself." "I know it," Phoebe said. "I prefer this corner. From here one sees the seams. How the footmen change hands, who counts the musicians in rather than clapping because she is tired of noise, where the floorboards complain." "Seams," he said, and could not have guessed how dear that word was to a woman raised to make herself smooth. "I suppose it is a kind of mercy to love the places where things join." "Or a kind of stubbornness," she said, "to insist there are places at all, and not only surfaces." They might have spoken longer, they might have said nothing and allowed the fact of themselves to do the speaking, but ballrooms are ecosystems jealous of any weather they did not order, and Lady Victoria's instinct for pressure was infallible. She arrived with Caroline like a bouquet, smiling the smile that says nothing is happening, but a great deal is expected. The Duke straightened the fraction he had allowed himself to relax. Phoebe, who had not leaned now, very slightly, into herself. "Your Grace," Lady Victoria said, batting the air into a politeness. "You have found my elder daughter. She is very good with the elderly. We hoped, Caroline, do show his Grace where the light is flattering. This room has cruel angles." Caroline curtsied, luminous. Phoebe thought, not unkindly, that her sister's gift was to be perfectly present wherever she stood. She could make any square foot of floor feel like the place everyone else had been foolish to abandon. It was not a gift Phoebe envied. It was one she respected as she might respect a virtuoso's wrist. The Duke inclined his head. "Lady Ashford, Miss Caroline." He kept his eyes where courtesy put them. Then he broke one rule, the one that says a conversation with one woman may be exited without acknowledging that she is a continent and not a dock, and glanced at Phoebe again. It was no more than the suggestion of a look. If one were a jealous person, one might have missed it. But for Phoebe, it felt like what happens when a sentence finds its verb at last and knows what it is capable of. "Enjoy the light," Phoebe said, "because the entire house of etiquette would fall if no words were placed in this space, and she would not be responsible for that collapse. It is an honest liar." He smiled fully now. "Those are my favorite kind." And then he went, and the room closed over the parting like water over a hand. Phoebe returned to the wall. She found her chair, her lemonade, her elderly allies, the seam in the floorboard that had always complained under too much expectation. She breathed. The world did not alter. The world had altered. She refused to name the difference. She would not be the one to say it first. The green dress kept her company, and did not tell. Later, when the carriages shook themselves like tired horses, and the house began to undress from its evening, Phoebe climbed the back stairs with her skirt lifted and her feet pleased to be privately ugly again. Isabel waited in her room with pins ready to reverse their commitments. "Well?" Belle asked, not like a girl hungry for gossip, but like a friend checking a pulse. "It was a ball," Phoebe said. "There were people and lights and opinions. The lemonade was superior." She sat, turned her head so Belle could undo the day. "And the Duke?" Isabel asked gently. "A man," Phoebe said. "He looked as if he had rehearsed being looked at, and had decided to play the role with mercy." Isabel's hands paused among the hair. "And did he look at you?" Phoebe could have laughed, could have tossed the question away as one tosses a plumb stone, careless and outward. Instead, she allowed herself the smallest possible truth, wrapped in silk so fine it would be invisible to anyone who did not know how to hold it. "Yes," she said, and felt the seam inside her, the place where hope and habit met, release a breath it had been holding for years. "As if I were not scenery." Belle's fingers resumed, deft and kind. "Then perhaps," she said, "the room was at its best after all." When Phoebe lay down, the rain had ceased. The house, like a body that had finally made it through a long day without disgracing itself, sank into honest exhaustion. She closed her eyes and saw nothing of chandeliers, nothing of blue silk or ambitious mothers or cruel angles of light. Instead, she saw a patch of floor near a refreshment table where two people had stood long enough to let something true into the room. She did not name it. She slept with the name just out of reach. like a word on the other side of a page. Morning broke as if the sky had argued with itself all night and decided on pale compromise. Phoebe woke before the bell and lay still, listening to the house assemble its courage, the rattle of scuttles along the hearth tiles, a cough swallowed by a corridor, the faint persuasion of a kettle urging water towards steam. She pulled a shawl around her shoulders and crossed to the window. The gravel sweep was stippled with yesterday's rain, the chestnut slick as polished bone. For a moment she let herself stand in the uncomplicated silence that follows a night of too many eyes. Then the quiet, acquired footsteps. "Miss Phoebe," came Blackwood's voice on the other side of her door, a careful knock accompanying it. "Forgive me, an early card." She opened to him, hair hastily braided, the shawl a makeshift dignity. On his silver tray lay a rectangle of cream so correct it might have been privately tutored. The crest in the corner was a fact even before it was read. "Thank you," she said, and when he did not at once retreat, she added, because kindness is a coin to be spent while one has it, "Have you slept at all, Blackwood?" "A butler, miss, sleeps between events, like a cat in the sun." He set the tray on the small writing desk and withdrew with discreet pleasure at his own line. Phoebe carried the card to the light and let herself read the name she already knew, as if the ink might hesitate and become someone else. His Grace the Duke of Westmoreland presented his compliments to Miss Ashford and requested, if convenient, to call upon the family this afternoon. There was no explanation, no flattery, only the kind of sentence that assumed it could exist without apology. Her heart did not leap. It did not even quicken. It merely changed its footing, as a person does on a stair when they encounter a missing step they have already learned to expect. Downstairs, the drawing-room was a theatre of readiness. Lady Victoria had taken up residence by the mantel in a gown with firm opinions. Caroline occupied the chaise like a moral lesson about posture, and vases had been encouraged into overachievement. "Ah," Lady Victoria said, tone clipped to prevent triumph from spilling. "You have seen the card. Excellent. We shall be equal to the occasion." "To what occasion?" Phoebe asked, perfectly mild. "Philanthropy," Lady Victoria said, with a smile that could have sliced bread. "His Grace will have decided to distribute some of his patronage, and requires a family to look benevolent beside him. He is not the sort to linger over lemonade with wallflowers." Caroline plucked an invisible bit of lint from her skirt and let it drift like a dismissed notion. "He is the sort to admire superior music," she said very softly, to herself as much as to the room. Miss Hartwell arrived, small spectacles in place like two new decisions. "The green suits you in daylight even better," she said to Phoebe. A smaller ribbon will do for this afternoon. We must look as if we belong in our own rooms. No theatre unless one is paid for it." "Miss Hartwell," Lady Victoria cautioned. "I mean no disrespect," the governess replied, unflustered. "But a duke in a drawing-room should find a family rather than a performance. He will have had enough of the latter last night." The house rehearsed itself at speed. Carpets were persuaded to lie flatter. Mrs. Hartley remanded a rebellious ash bucket. Flowers were reallocated to corners that normally had to make do with mere geometry. Phoebe wrote a neat acceptance in her plain hand and sent it with Blackwood's approval to the universe. He came earlier than the clock had promised, which felt like something more than punctuality and not quite impatience. When the door opened to the words, "Your Grace," the room straightened without seeming to move. He entered neither as a conqueror nor as a supplicant, but with the even weight of a person who knew where his feet were. A riding coat of dark green, boots that acknowledged mud existed but had never been allowed to tell its story indoors, a face that managed solemnity and humour in truce. "Lady Ashford," he said, bowing the bow prescribed by tradition and tempered by sincerity. "Miss Caroline, Miss Ashford." The last without hesitation, without glancing down a mental list. Phoebe felt some small, long-disciplined muscle inside her unclench and look around. "Your Grace," Lady Victoria returned, "our house is honoured. Caroline was about to play the harp. We had not dared hope." "If I might beg your indulgence," he said, courteous interruption honed to a respectable instrument. "I was told your library is not inconsiderable. I confess to a vice for other people's bookshelves." "Would Miss Ashford," he glanced at Phoebe and did not apologize for doing so, "walk me through my trespass?" There are moments in a house when a silence assembles out of the air and sits down as if it were a relative. Lady Victoria's smile held. Caroline's fingers hovered above strings. An angel surprised mid-breath. Miss Hartwell's mouth made the smallest "oh" and immediately rearranged itself into nothing. "Of course," Lady Victoria said finally, each word stamped to leave an impression. "Phoebe will be delighted to assist." The library received them as it received weather, with acceptance and a quiet promise to outlast it. Shelves inhaled. Ladders minded their business. Dust pretended to be sunlight. Phoebe stepped inside and felt, as always, her mind set down its luggage. He paused just beyond the threshold, as if asking permission of the books. It was ridiculous to be grateful to a man for that. She was grateful anyway. "You see," he said, not moving at random but with aim disguised as curiosity, "I am told by reliable informants that your father once acquired a first-edition Shelley and then hid it behind sermons to protect it from a bishop." "Not a bishop," Phoebe said, smiling before she could prevent it. "An uncle with a memory like treacle. He would borrow books, return nothing, and remember everything. We hid Shelley because he would have kept it for its scandal and insisted to himself it was for its poetry." "A crime of taste," the Duke murmured, and then, finding the right shelf, as if the book had lifted its hand to be called on, said, "May I?" He did not reach until she nodded. He did not open the volume until he had set it on the table with the respect one gives a sleeping cat. They stood side by side, the page wide between them like a sober shoreline. He ran his gaze down the long vowels, the stubborn commas, the arguments a dead man had refused to stop having. "Do you ever feel," he said after a moment, a note of surprise in his tone at the fact he was saying it aloud, "that a poem does the one impolite thing we all hunger for? It refuses to be liked for the wrong reasons?" "Yes," she said, and realized how much of her life had been spent arranging herself not to be mistaken for anything other than what she was not, and that it pays for that refusal in solitude until one person says, "I recognize you." He looked up then, eyes dark as if they carried weather. It was not a romantic gaze. It was a human one, a recognition clicking into place. She felt the click mirror itself inside her, like a latch consenting. He did not speak in speeches. He asked what she read when she could not bear to be improved by a book. She admitted to essays that made opinions feel like rooms one might open and leave. He confessed to a weakness for pamphlets that were more angry than sensible, because they reminded him that ordinary people had to shout to be heard. She told him about the Society for the Education of Working Children, and he listened as if she had presented him with a map and a choice of roads. A schoolroom with decent windows, he said, would save half the doctor's bills on my northern estates, and that is not sentiment. It is arithmetic. And a pump that doesn't sulk when asked for water, she replied, and when he laughed it was not an elegant sound, it had a crack in it. Miss Hartwell arrived after a respectable interval with tea arranged like a diplomatic treaty. She assessed the table with trained indifference, gathered up 2 stray paper corners with the air of a woman who had more often been a hinge than a door, and departed. They drank tea that tasted of permission and talked in the plain, clean way 2 minds do when they are not trying to barter for affection. When they returned to the drawing-room, it had been freshly arranged to look as if it had not been waiting. Caroline's harp waited, strings shivering ever so slightly as if they remembered being touched. Lady Victoria's smile had migrated half an inch toward nervousness, then decided no, dignity would do. The Duke accepted a seat, the correct compliments, the offer of air. Caroline played beautifully, truly beautifully, and Phoebe felt the particular little ache of witnesses who know themselves to be, in many respects, not needed. If the Duke applauded more than custom demanded and less than adoration required, if his attention wandered once like a man who has left a candle burning somewhere he cannot recall, only Phoebe, who had stood in the library with him while a poem rearranged the furniture of a morning, would have noticed. She squashed the observation like a treacherous thought. She would not be the person who measured other women's light to see whether it cast her in shadow. He rose sooner than Lady Victoria would have wished, later than strict brevity insisted. At the door he hesitated an honest second, as if searching for the sentence that would not corrode, then said, for the room, "Thank you for your hospitality." And for Phoebe alone, "If you should ever wish to see the Westmoreland collection, the catalogue is less tiresome when one has company." It was not an invitation. It was an instrument placed carefully on a table where a person could discover it later and decide to learn it. After he had gone and the room's temperature slumped into ordinary, Lady Victoria allowed herself to pace. "Books," she said, making the word do heavier labour than it deserved. "We must, perhaps, be grateful that the world contains one thing that can distract a man from his grief and his duty, and that we possess a room full of it. Phoebe, for heaven's sake, next time tilt your head. No, not so much. You'll look obstinate." Caroline unfastened a bracelet and set it down as if returning a token after a game. "He did not look at my hair," she said, not resentful so much as puzzled. "He did," Phoebe murmured, and immediately regretted speaking. "He looked at everything. He has the gaze of a careful steward." "Gaze," Lady Victoria repeated, the syllable sour. "Gazes do not sign marriage settlements. Phoebe, do write to Mrs. Fielding about the roses. More roses. The room must smell like inevitability." Phoebe retreated to the only jurisdiction she had ever possessed without argument. Paper. She drafted the note. She drafted also, because courage is a habit and must be fed daily, a small letter to Mr. D. at the Society, detailing an idea about printed handbills on hand-washing to be distributed outside the brewery shifts. Practicality saved lives more reliably than romance, and if everyone insisted on asking her to think, she would do it properly. The day folded into evening. Phoebe took to the garden, which had the honest courtesy to belong to itself. Paths curved the way sentences should. Bees insisted on their opinions. She sat on a stone bench warmed by late sun and opened a book, but read none of it. The mind, when busy pretending not to hope, is an absent reader. She heard the gravel's small throat clear and looked up to see Blackwood carrying a shallow parcel wrapped in brown paper as if it were a sleeping thing. "A messenger from Westmoreland House, miss," he said, and those words would alter meaning in the years to come in ways that nobody could yet guess. "For you." He offered the parcel as if it might decide to fly away. She unfolded paper to cloth and cloth to leather, and there lay a slim volume she had long admired in catalogues and never expected to touch. A small book of sonnets, well loved but not exhausted, a corner mended by a careful hand. A note had been tucked under the ribbon like a breath. "Miss Ashford, our conversation has been unreasonably pleasant to recall. Perhaps this small companion might help it happen again when we are in separate rooms. W." She did not press the book to her chest like a heroine in a painting because she disliked paintings in which women did not know they were being looked at. She ran her fingertip down the title and then set it on her lap, as one rests a bird that has been allowed for once to choose the branch. Blackwood coughed softly into his glove and studied a peony with exaggerated interest. "Blackwood," she said, because a word should not bear more freight than its structure can carry, "do not tell my mother unless directly asked." He considered the peony's future. "I have always found," he said, "that truth delivered in the correct order saves furniture. Thank you. Your father," he added, as if recollection had just lifted a hand from a chair, "is in his study and has contrived to make tea himself. The kettle will soon assert its own will." "Perhaps, perhaps," she said, smiling. She gathered the book without dramatics and went to rescue the tea kettle and her father both. Sir William was a man who had been born with decency and had learned to disguise it under mildness so that people would not feel the need to correct it. He looked up when Phoebe entered, face brightening in the gentle way of a lamp turned up a notch. "Ah, my clever girl," he said. "Come see whether this pot has any sense." They drank tea that had been bullied into goodness, and spoke of manageable things, of a tenant's cow that had decided to calve inconveniently, of a letter from a cousin in Bath who had discovered the sea did not like her. When she rose to go, Sir William touched her sleeve with a shyness that still astonished her after all these years. "Your mother," he said awkwardly, as if introducing her to a person she had somehow never met, "means well." "I know." Phoebe set her hand over his. "She loves us in the grammar she was taught. And you," he cleared his throat, "you are good. Whatever anyone says about ornament, you are good." "I am," Phoebe said, accepting the compliment like a glass of water, necessary and not to be argued with. "And I will be." The next weeks unfolded with a mixture of repetition and delicate change, like a waltz learned so well that it could bear improvisation without stumbling. The Duke called more than once, and less than scandal demanded. Sometimes he asked for Sir William's view on a boundary dispute, as if Sir William had always been asked such things. Sometimes he asked after Caroline's music, with a courtesy that feared boredom the way good men fear cruelty. Usually, always, he found his way to the library and behaved as if it were a place where conclusions did not have to be rushed into without their hats. They read with the intensity of people who know reading is a rehearsal for choosing. They spoke of mines and mills and air and light as if these were moral entities. When she argued, he did not smile indulgently and wait for her to become reasonable. He argued back and sometimes conceded and sometimes did not. When he sent books, they were not showpieces. They were small soldiers with fresh orders. When she sent pamphlet drafts, he returned them with a pencil's quiet remarks in the margin. This line stings. Good. Here. Too harsh. They will throw it away. Add an example. The men will remember it at the pump. If gossip began to learn her name, it did so with confusion. She was not the expected story. It is hard to instruct rumors how to be interesting about women who do not perform interest. Lady Victoria managed drawing rooms with a finesse that would have made cabinet secretaries jealous, and spoke of Caroline as if the sun, having risen faithfully for thousands of years, might still be convinced to do a little better. Caroline, for her part, looked at her sister between rehearsals with a new curiosity that was not ownership and not pity. "You speak with him as if it were raining, and you both preferred weather to opinion," she said once, half compliment, half wonder. "We speak because there is something to say," Phoebe replied, and the simplicity of that sentence sounded to her own ears like wealth. There was resistance. Of course there was. Lady Cordelia Westwood, whose beauty had been taught to wear malice like perfume, remarked within earshot of people who would repeat it with the zeal of missionaries that some men, after an unfortunate first marriage, sought safety in dullness. A columnist, whose wit had never learned to carry anything heavier than innuendo, wrote a sour paragraph about a certain northern nobleman's sudden interest in educational schemes as a convenient pretext for visiting respectable houses with unfashionable daughters. Servants carried whispers on their trays and ate them behind the scullery door. Phoebe learned in those weeks something about the particular steel that hides under gentleness. The remarks hurt. Then they did not. Then they did again, and she noticed the hurt rather than believed it. When anger came, it came clean and went to work. She wrote an even clearer handbill about the pump. She argued twice as well because crying takes time, and she preferred to spend that currency on conjunctions. Once, on an afternoon with a sky the color of boiled milk and a wind that could not make up its mind, he arrived without the usual 15-minute warning that allows a household to rearrange its virtue. Blackwood announced him, and then, with the discretion of a saint, vanished as if swallowed by an architectural feature. The Duke stood in the doorway of the library and did not touch his hat-brim as if ready to flee. He held it at his side like a decision already made. "Forgive the discourtesy of no card," he said, breath not quite steady. "An article appeared this morning, a vulgarity, and I found myself preferring the only remedy I trust, conversation with someone who doesn't mistake noise for meaning." She had read the article. She had turned the paper face down with a calm that had taken all her morning to earn. "Tea," she said. She poured it like medicine, 2 cups, strong, no frills. He drank his as if remembering he possessed a mouth. "I am less angry for myself," he said at last, "than for the way grief is made into a theatre for strangers. They take my late wife and use her as a prop to point at someone else." "It is indecent." "It is," she agreed, the simple affirmation sounding like a hand placed on a railing before the descent of a steep stair. "And it is also, alas, the tax the world thinks it can impose on those who refuse to perform according to plan." He paced to the shelves and leaned his forehead briefly against the wood between Austen and Addison. He did not weep. He did not require rescuing. He stood like a man on a deck in a wind and found his stance. When he turned, his mouth had found its own version of control. "I cannot bear—" He stopped, examined the phrase, changed it. I will not allow the story to be written by people who sell sentences like cheap oranges. She knew then, as surely as she had known anything outside of books, that whatever came next would not be a courtship performed for mirrors. It would be a negotiation between equals who had both learned to distrust applause. "I have brought you something that is either a gift or an imposition," he said, as if remembering civility could be practical. He took from his coat a sheaf of papers tied with blue ribbon and set them on the table with the carefulness he reserved for things that might break and could not be mended with money. "These are reports from my northern overseers on school attendance and the state of the wells. I am tired of letting men who do not read hand me numbers I cannot test. If you would, if you want, if you have time—" He smiled, abashed not by his rank, but by his need. "Mark them, improve them, tell me when they lie." She considered the bundle as one considers a creature that might, with patience, allow a gentle hand. She untied the ribbon and read the first page while he stood, because reading in company with someone willing to wait is a private sacrament. She found, within 3 paragraphs, a place where the sums had been encouraged to flatter. She pointed, he groaned, and they set to work. Afternoon went home and sent evening to sit in its chair. Lamps were called, hours named, and still the two of them bent over numbers and towns and the stubbornness of mud. When he left, late and steadier, Blackwood met him with his hat and an expression that suggested the house approved. In the corridor, the Duke paused and looked toward the library door, where light made a small square on the floor. Phoebe did not see it. She was gathering the reports into an order that would persuade even a penny-pinching steward to be honest. In the days that followed, London experimented with new stories. Some people found it very dull indeed to learn that the Duke of Westmoreland appeared to prefer committees to cotillions and conversations with a woman everyone had mistaken for a piece of furniture to the attentions of women who had been expressly crafted to receive attention. Others, less committed to boredom, dared to be interested. The tide of curiosity turned and ebbed and returned, as tiresome tides will. The household managed. Lady Victoria educated every bouquet that arrived into her own narrative. Caroline practiced a piece by a modern composer whom nobody yet knew how to admire, and found that she liked the way its dissonance made the air honest. One evening, as spring scratched politely at the windows and asked to be let in, the family hosted a small supper for people who preferred talk to spectacle. The dining room glowed with the sort of light that flatters both good china and sincerity. Lord Harrington sent his son James, who surprised everyone by possessing an actual mind. A professor from Oxford, whose hair had been organized by ideas rather than by fashion, sat at Sir William's right. The Duke took the place at Phoebe's left, as if it had been designed for him and for no other man. Conversation ranged like a dog, curious, loyal, occasionally distracted, always returning to heel. "What I cannot forgive," said the professor, spearing an asparagus with the intensity of a duel, "is the way education is treated as charity when it is, in fact, the most selfishly intelligent investment any country can make. Who will pay my pension if not the clever child of a man who currently cannot read?" "Quite," said the Duke. "And who will keep my fields sown with yields I can be proud of if the men in them have never been invited to understand the seasons as anything other than orders?" "Invitations," Phoebe murmured, half to herself. "That is the word. People do better when the future knocks on their door and uses their name." He glanced at her with that quick recognition that now felt like the natural act of a face he had always possessed. "Then we shall knock and practice the name until we have the music of it." After supper, when people sought corners for the private exchange of earnestness, Caroline sat beside Phoebe on a settee upholstered in dignity. She folded and unfolded her napkin as if it might tell the weather. "He looks at you," she said, with a sister's economy. "He looks at everything," Phoebe answered. "Not like that," Caroline said, and smiled without envy, which made Phoebe want to love her more than she already did. Later still, when the guests had gone home with bundles of conversation to be unpacked, Lady Victoria, who had not ceased attempting to shepherd fate with polite crooks, found Phoebe in the corridor and took her hand with a grip that surprised them both. "If this happens," she said, not naming anything, because naming is more terrifying than pretending, "will you forgive me for having failed to see it?" Phoebe lifted her mother's hand and pressed it once, a benediction they had not rehearsed. "You taught me where the forks go," she said, smiling. "I can manage the rest." The house slept that night with fewer creaks than usual, as if it had been fed with safer dreams. Phoebe lay awake longer than was prudent, and allowed herself, just once, just briefly, the luxury of imagining a future in which mornings began not with absence, but with a conversation already underway. She did not place a coronet on her head in that picture. She did not rehearse curtsies or count titles to calm her breathing. She saw a map of a northern estate laid open on a table, a finger tracing a line where a new pump might stand, a margin where a pencil had written, "Try this," and a voice behind her saying, "Not if, but when." In the garden 2 days later, she tested the word aloud softly to a rose that would not betray her. When? The bloom, being a rose, took the compliment and did not respond. The letter that arrived the next morning was short. "My steward intends to dig a new well at Bracken Row without consulting the engineer we both admire. I have told him to wait until I can bring the only person who has managed to make me like numbers. Saturday, if the weather does not object. C." She wrote yes without showing the paper to anyone, and brought the note down to Blackwood with the same gravity she would have granted a confession. He read nothing he did not need, and arranged for the carriage without informing the furniture. Miss Hartwell, sensing with governess's instinct that history is simply a series of appointments kept or missed, advised sturdy boots. Lady Victoria, told only what could be told without starting a small weather system, found that she could breathe if she did it in steps. Saturday arrived, dressed in its good coat. The road north unrolled like a sentence that knew where it was going. In the carriage, they did not flirt. They did not pretend not to be thinking. They talked about aquifers and wages and how to make a bell rope less unfair to the boy who pulled it. They talked as if the world were a room they could furnish with usefulness and then live in. At Bracken Row, men touched their caps and tried not to stare at the woman the Duke brought to the edge of a muddy square and asked, "Here?" She asked to see the plans, listened to the ground with her eyes, and shook her head. "Closer to the elm," she said, "for the clay's sake, and move the drain 2 yards, or you'll set the women to cursing you before Michaelmas." The engineer, waiting with faint impatience that dissolved like sugar in tea, nodded with the quick respect of one tradesman recognizing another. "She's right," he said to the Duke. "The slope cheats you where you've marked it. You'll spend a year arguing with gravity and lose." The men laughed, not unkindly. The Duke laughed too and said, "Then we will not argue with gravity. We shall flirt with it instead and get what we want." He looked at Phoebe, and there was in his gaze a thing she had tried not to name, because naming is a ceremony and a promise both. It was not gratitude and not admiration only. It was partnership, clear and fierce, and settled at last on its own feet. They walked the fields until the sun began to pretend it was tired. Mud climbed their boots and forgave them. Children dogged their steps with the sincere curiosity of people who believed an adult might say something worth learning. Phoebe gathered names the way a careful person gathers seeds. Millie, whose mother coughed all winter. Tom, whose talents with a spade would grow into something else. Mrs. Gray, who demanded a bench set at the pump because she had decided to be old with a certain amenity. She promised nothing she could not bring, and this, more than anything, made the people trust her. On the return, the carriage hummed with the satisfaction of ordinary triumph. The Duke sat with one elbow propped and one hand loose, a man not rehearsing his face for any audience. "I had forgotten," he said, "that a day can go by in which the only spectacle is usefulness." "It is the most flattering light," she said. "And you," he added, not hurried and not performative, "flourish in it." She looked at him fully and allowed the fact of his words to sit between them, not gussied up in astonishment or coyness. "As do you." The road took them home. Evening gathered itself and began, as ever, to behave like a blessing if one didn't stare too hard at it. In the space between their words, a shape had formed. It would not entirely be named tonight. That was right. Some truths consent to be spoken only after they have been lived for a while. But when the carriage turned into the sweep of Ravenscroft and the chestnut leaned, listening as it always had, Phoebe felt the old house notice the difference in the woman who stepped down. She was the same. She was not. She carried a book of sonnets in her pocket, and the memory of a field in her shoes and a yes somewhere in her bones that would, when asked, know itself. News is a careless sculptor. It chisels people into shapes that fit the mantelpieces of other people's homes. The piece that appeared on a scandal sheet the following week did not name Phoebe. Cowardice rarely does. But it named all the things she had refused to be and pretended they were the only things she was. There was an elder daughter described as sensible to a fault, and a northern nobleman who had discovered that conversation with a woman can be a more agreeable retirement than a monastery. It pitied Caroline very prettily. It mourned the late Duchess with a piety that smelled like something kept in a drawer. It named kindness a strategy, and grief a costume, and helpfulness a bribe. People read it because people like to be deputized into cynicism. It lets them feel they have been clever without ever having to be brave. And Lady Victoria read it in the breakfast room and folded the paper with surgical precision. "It could have been worse," she said, and so of course it immediately was. 3 invitations arrived that afternoon, proposing Caroline to sing, to pour, to be looked at under new chandeliers. 2 arrived addressed to Phoebe with the faint, puzzled flourish of a hostess who had suddenly remembered there are older daughters in the world. The Duke called less conspicuously and with more intention. He sent books with fewer exclamation marks in his notes and asked, in a hand-grown firmer, for drafts of the school handbills before the press. He had not retreated from anything important, and yet the air in the house learned how to hold its breath for longer without complaint. On a rain-creased Tuesday, a note came stamped with an escutcheon that had paid for too much bad behaviour to be innocent. Lady Cordelia Westwood intended to pay a call. Lady Victoria went instantly beautiful with alarm. "She is a thunderstorm," she said, smoothing a cushion that had never once rebelled. Smile at lightning, and it will believe you mean it. Lady Cordelia arrived like gossip that had bathed. She wore the kind of silk that taught chairs to mind their manners, and a perfume that wanted to be a rumour. Her eyes were a blue that had been instructed since infancy in the art of value. "My dear Lady Ashford," she murmured, delivering kisses the way a general delivers orders, lightly, but with consequences. "Caroline, radiant as ever, and Miss Ashford." The pause before Phoebe's name had the exact length of a knife entering a sheath. "How charming to be finally introduced. I have heard that your library is the cleverest room in London, and I believe it at once. It sits so far from the street." "Cordelia," Lady Victoria said pleasantly, as one might welcome the plague with tea, "what an honour." They sat. Tea flirted with saucers. Conversation wore a hat. Lady Cordelia arranged herself in the chair opposite Phoebe, as if the upholstery had been waiting its entire life to be inhabited by a particular angle. She never quite looked at the space between them. People like Cordelia train their gaze like hunting dogs, and rarely allow it to rest unless there is something to bite. "I had the most diverting afternoon last week," she said, "at the milliner's, of all unpromising places. Do you know Mrs. Ellison, Lady Ashford? A genius with ribbons. One must forgive her clients for what her work does to their heads. I ran into Mr. Talbot. You remember the columnist who misquotes everyone in a tone of such benevolence that we thank him for it. And he insisted on speaking of philanthropy." She rolled the word on her tongue as if it were a foreign sweet. "Apparently, a certain nobleman is developing a great passion for schools. So admirable. It is always a relief when men find a new hobby in their 30s. Some men," Phoebe said before she could stop herself, "call duty a hobby when it cannot be postponed." Lady Cordelia's lashes drifted down and up, a slow applause. "How sensible! You must be a comfort to your mother, a daughter who prefers duty to other kinds of pleasure." "I prefer what lasts," Phoebe replied, steady. "Pleasure that can survive daylight is a rare and good thing. The rest is simply light." A tiny smile unfurled at the corner of Cordelia's mouth, a flag of acknowledgement between opponents who both know the sport they're playing. How fortunate, then, that daylight is so fashionable this season. Everyone is learning to be seen. She set her teacup down, the porcelain making the faintest kiss with the saucer. "Forgive me, I am a beast. It is only that grief teaches one strange appetites for truth. My cousin knew the late Duchess, beautiful, unhappy creature. Grief carves us into shapes we did not consent to. One must be careful what one becomes in the hands of other people's chisels." Caroline shifted, uncertain for once whether to be charmed or warned. Lady Victoria's smile took on a luminous fatigue. "We are all at the mercy of the press," she said, careful to use the plural and to include herself in the suffering. "We endure, and we go on, and we hope to be useful in the end." "Useful?" Cordelia repeated, weighing the word. "Yes, and then sometimes, very occasionally, something more than useful." She stood, her dress arranging itself into a poem. "I must go and be seen, not to be difficult elsewhere. Miss Ashford, what a relief to find there is one woman in London who pronounces the word duty without making it sound like a sermon or an alibi." She smiled with all her beautiful teeth. "Do be careful. It is a dangerous word to pronounce too often. Some men mistake it for consent." After she left, the room exhaled through its cornices. Caroline rose and crossed to the window as if seeking weather that belonged to another house. "She is awful," she said softly, with the unstudied honesty of a sister alone with the truth, "and rather magnificent." "She is a weather vane that believes it is the wind," Phoebe said, and was immediately ashamed because it is easy to be clever about a woman with fewer restraints than oneself. "Forgive me. I am tired." Lady Victoria pressed a hand to her temples as if stopping thoughts from spilling. "We must be practical," she murmured. "Whatever is or is not happening, we must be practical." Practicality, once invited, moved in with trunks. There was the matter of a charity gala at St. Bartholomew's for the hospital's new wing. The committee, which had learned to value Phoebe's checklists more than her conversation, begged for her help in arranging a subscription table and organizing the speeches so that the dullest men spoke earliest when the audience's mercy is still abundant. The Duke, asked to give remarks on education and public health, agreed with the expression of a man planning to eat plain bread for supper because the day had required cake. Lady Victoria contrived a dress for Phoebe that looked like she had dressed herself by accident, and another for Caroline that looked like an intention. On the night, the church hall filled with the kind of earnestness that wears good shoes. Candles stuttered, air collected on windows. Gentlemen discovered that lifting a pen for a subscription could, in certain lights, resemble courage. The Duke arrived unadorned by entourage and read his notes without trying to be beloved by anyone who would never vote for him. He named towns and children and pumps and wages and the simple arithmetic of not dying, and the room, used to being flattered, found itself being enlisted. When he finished, there were people who clapped because clapping is what hands know to do. There were also people who signed. Phoebe counted the latter and allowed herself a private, precise joy. It was after, when the room thinned to a manageable rattle, and the clergyman discovered a tin of biscuits in a drawer someone had labelled Hope, that conflict decided to step out from the wing and claim a place on the stage. Mr. Talbot, kind eyes, cruel sentences, appeared at Phoebe's elbow with an expression of flattery that felt like a hair shirt disguised as velvet. "Miss Ashford," he said, pressing a smile into service, "may I steal you for a moment of sense? You seem to have a few to spare." "I am not a bank," she said lightly. "Ah," he replied, delighted by the opening he had made for himself, "and yet the city is convinced you have made a certain deposit." He tipped his head toward the Duke, who stood across the room listening to an old surgeon talk about sores the way men talk about war. "We are all so very grateful to you for reminding His Grace that there is life after tragedy." Phoebe looked at Talbot the way one looks at a boy who has set a trap for a bird and is waiting, eager to be praised for his cunning. "I hope," she said, "that life itself reminded him. I am very busy reminding pumps." "Come, come," he coaxed. "Do let me print in a few tasteful words that you are a tonic. Miss A, a model of practical kindness, has taught a grieving man to smile again. The public loves to be told that sadness is curable in women of a certain plainness." She set her shoulders back and recalled, clearly, gratefully, what the Duke had said in her father's study. "I will not allow the story to be written by people who sell sentences like cheap oranges." "Mr. Talbot," she said evenly, "you will write what you like. You always do. But if you are determined to write about me, do me the courtesy of telling the truth. I am not a tonic. I am not a saint. I am a woman who expects water to come out of wells and figures to tell the truth and men to keep their promises. Anything you cannot praise in that is your poverty, not mine." Talbot blinked, a cat surprised by a bird that refused to act like a feather. "Very good," he said softly, storing the words the way one stores weather reports. Useful if it rains on the day one intends a picnic. The Duke reached them then, the surgeon called back to his sores by a parishioner with a suspicious cough. He read the air. He always did. "Mr. Talbot," he said, more courtesy than warmth, "you have misquoted me so handsomely this month that I considered thanking you for improving my prose. Please allow me to pay for that improvement with the only coin I have." He looked at Phoebe, not at the floor, not at the middle distance. "Miss Ashford, would you walk with me as far as the vestry door? I wish to be seen asking permission for things." It was a sentence with two audiences. Talbot, whose ears pricked at sentences like dogs at partridges, bowed himself into another conversation. Phoebe set her hand on the Duke's offered arm and allowed the new electricity of attention to rattle along the walls without leaping to touch it. In the short corridor to the vestry, a place that smelled of wax and old practicality, he stopped and faced her directly, hands behind his back, as if he mistrusted them to mind their manners if left unattended. "I should have spoken to you before," he said, and the opening frightened her enough that she learned a new stillness. "I should have said that the way I come and the way I look and the way we both stand in rooms is not an accident I am allowing to happen to me. It is a decision. But decisions, when they concern more than one person, become requests waiting for permission." She considered him, the way one considers a bridge before stepping onto it. "Permission for what?" she asked, not coy, not deflecting, simply asking for the noun that would be placed in the blank. "For you to be pulled into the cold," he said, and then, because a man determined to be honest must be unkind to himself at least once in a conversation, or into the warmth, depending on your talent for weather. "I cannot promise safety. I can promise attention and the refusal to lie. I can promise, if you say no, that I will not punish you by pretending it was yes." She let out a breath she had not noticed she was folding. "You are not asking me anything yet," she said, surprised at the relief in the truth. "You are warning me." "Yes." "Then I grant permission to be warned," she said. "And I grant permission for you to continue being seen near my father's books, which improve your face." He laughed, helplessly, with the cracked note she loved for its admission. That perfection had never been invited to this conversation. "Very well," he said. "We will continue to be seen in the company of paper. It will anger the right people." When they returned to the hall, Lady Cordelia materialized from a cluster of admirers like a small god stepping out of its shrine. She had been everywhere and heard enough to improvise the rest. "Your Grace," she purred, "I must commend you on your remarks. I adore a man who can say cholera and still be handsome." "It is a gift," he said dryly. "And you," she added, turning to Phoebe with a compassion that had been ironed flat, "are so brave to endure all this attention. Women like us prefer quiet rooms. We must be so careful. Public admiration is so dangerous when it is unaccustomed." "Admiration is dangerous when it is mistaken for affection," Phoebe said gently. "I try not to confuse the two." "Wise," Cordelia breathed, and for the first time her eyes cooled by a degree. Do continue to be wise, Miss Ashford. It will make everything hurt a little less. After the gala, the city became a chorus with parts that did not agree. Certain ladies decided that a romance conducted among books must be inherently uninteresting, and therefore must be safe to watch. Certain men decided that any woman who could make the Duke laugh could not be entirely plain. Certain servants decided that Miss Ashford tipped generously because she remembered names. And such decisions travel through a house like water through pipes. It finds all the places other sentiments cannot reach. But conflict, having announced itself, refused to leave politely. A letter arrived at Ravenscroft, sealed with the black wax of the Dowager Westmoreland. Lady Margaret's hand was as crisp as frost and as fair as a ledger. She requested, with the regal courtesy of a woman unaccustomed to being refused anything other than immortality, that Miss Ashford accompany her to view the Westmoreland almshouses on Thursday. Lady Victoria read it twice, and then a third time, because the words insisted on being true. "It is a summons," she whispered, both terrified and dazzled. "It is an audit." Phoebe went. Of course she did. She dressed as if the day might be instructive. Miss Hartwell insisted on gloves that would not show mud. Isabel tucked a needle and a coil of thread into her pocket, as if there were any tear that could be mended with that. The Dowager met her at the townhouse with an embrace that was not an embrace, a scent of lavender that had learned to be a weapon, and a gaze that had raised a son and buried a daughter-in-law, and had not unlearned how to weigh a soul. "You are punctual," Lady Margaret said as their carriage set out. "Men who are late waste money. Women who are late waste the patience of servants. I admire thrift of both kinds." "I am early sometimes," Phoebe said, and then found she had confessed something unguarded. "Books have taught me to be early." "Books have taught you many things," the Dowager said. "They may yet teach you to forgive people for not having read them." The almshouses stood in a row of dogged brick, windows polished into usefulness, steps swept within an inch of the residents' pride. The Dowager proceeded through them like a general inspecting troops. She spoke to the women about coughs and grandchildren, to the men about roofs and whiskey, to the children about letters, as if they were small animals that could be tamed. Phoebe watched, learned, answered when asked in a language that did not require anyone to pretend they were not tired. When Mrs. Abel, whose husband had been crushed under a cartwheel 6 years ago and still stood every morning as if the day might bring him back, began to cry, Phoebe tied on an apron without making a ceremony of it and helped in the kitchen until the Dowager's groom had located the doctor with the good hands. On the carriage ride back, Lady Margaret did not ask any of the polite questions that stand in for interrogation. She said at last, in the tone of a woman addressing not her daughter but the truth, "My son is a difficult man to wound and a very easy man to disappoint. One uses up one's life deciding which injury one can live with. Are you easily disappointed, Miss Ashford?" "I am easily bored," Phoebe said, and the Dowager's mouth permitted itself to approve for half a second. "Good. Boredom is the only vice we can afford in this country. And you," she glanced, keen and not unkind, "you are not obvious. I am old enough to know that obviousness has its uses. It is not one I want for my son. If you intend to be kind to him, you will find that the world will accuse you of ambition. If you intend to be intelligent for him, they will accuse you of cruelty. Decide now how much weather you can live in." Phoebe looked out at the city, at the mirrors of windows and the truthful mud, and the way light had the same habits on rich and poor brick. "I have lived most of my life in the weather other people made," she said. "If I am allowed to choose any of it now, I will be greedy." "Good," said the dowager. "If you had said humble, I would have asked the coachman to let you out." At home, Lady Victoria paced until the hall rug considered revolt. "Well?" she demanded the second the door opened, before Phoebe's foot had recalled it belonged to their own floor. "What did she say? What did she mean? Did she—" "She weighed me," Phoebe said, unpinning her hat, "and found me neither hollow nor heavy." Lady Victoria sat down, an unpractised surrender. "I was cruel to you," she said suddenly, voice gone thin. "Not intentionally, but effectively. I wanted safety so badly for this house that I forgot to want happiness for its people." She lifted her hand and let it fall. "If this comes to anything, if it does, I will pretend I planned it. You must allow me that. I have so few vanities left, and people expect it of me." Phoebe crossed and took both her mother's hands in a gesture that would have surprised them both a year ago. "You taught me steadiness," she said. "That is not nothing. We will waste no time with apologies. There is too much useful work." Conflict, having failed to frighten her into retreat, changed tactics. It arrived as doubt, soft-footed, persuasive, the kind of guest who rearranges furniture while you are sleeping. She found herself hesitating before stepping into rooms where she knew she would find him, not because she feared him, but because she feared herself. Feared the way a glance could become a habit, and a habit a necessity. She scolded herself for it, and saw the scolding for what it was. The last trick of a woman who had learned to live on the edges, telling herself the centre was vulgar. And there were tests. At a musicale given by a countess with excellent acoustics and appalling taste, the Duke entered late and allowed himself to be detained by exactly the wrong person, Lady Cordelia, beneath the benevolent glare of 100 eyes. He bent to hear her. He made her laugh. He gave, for an entire piece by Haydn, the appearance of a man who might be amenable to the consolations of glitter. Phoebe sat in the third row, exactly where new money and old intelligence intersect and disagree, and practiced the discipline of letting another woman be seen speaking to a man she liked, without inventing a catastrophe to justify her feelings. She succeeded almost completely, and thought this might be what adulthood feels like. After, in a corridor where the wallpaper had learned to be expensive by being so boring that nobody could complain, he found her. He did not touch her. He lifted no curtain of excuses, offered no ledger of reasons. "She wished to be seen," he said simply. "I allowed it. It cost nothing I was not willing to spend." He looked at her with calm that had been paid for elsewhere. "May I never behave in such a way that you must excuse me? If I do, withdraw my credit." She smiled then, because relief is a very silly emotion when it remembers how to stand, and because respect is warmer when it has had to endure the cold. "I prefer exact accounts," she said, "and interest when deserved." Through it all, Caroline surprised her. She did not sulk. She did not posture as a wronged princess, cheated of a plot that had been promised to her by the shape of her cheekbones. She took up, instead, a small rebellion against the script society keeps for pretty girls. She began to teach music to the daughters of the almshouse women twice a week, sitting on chairs that apologized for nothing, showing clever fingers how to make sound into something dignified. When Lady Cordelia heard of it and raised a delicate eyebrow, Caroline smiled with more serenity than Phoebe had believed possible and said, "Scales do not care what people think of me. That is why I love them." The city continued its argument, as cities will. The dowager said nothing more for a fortnight, and then, like weather, appeared again and asked whether Miss Ashford might consider accompanying her to the country in June, to see whether the roses at Westmoreland have learned their manners. It was not a test plate set before a dog. It was the thing itself, offered unadorned. Phoebe took the letter to the library and stood at the window where rain once had traced thin threads, thinking of first mornings and early cards and the green dress that had believed in her. She thought of pumps and pamphlets and the arithmetic of not dying. She thought of the word when, whispered to a rose that had not answered. She thought of the seam inside herself where habit and hope had learned to share a room. Doubt tried one more time, because doubt is tireless, and asked whether she was merely a safe harbour for a ship that would, in the end, always prefer glory to peace. She answered it with the only argument she trusted. She wrote to Lady Margaret and said yes. The countryside estate of Westmoreland stretched like a solemn hymn across the landscape, stone walls scarred by centuries of storms, oaks that had memorized entire dynasties, fields bruised with the honest labor of men who knew little of the politics that consumed their masters. It was here, far from the clamour of London and the breathless rehearsals of drawing-rooms, that Phoebe came to understand both the privilege and peril of being seen. For the first weeks of summer, she and the Duke walked those grounds as if they had been written for them, he pointing out tenants and troubles, she noticing seams and silences others ignored. They spoke of water tables and wages, but beneath their practical sentences a deeper conversation hummed, the unspoken admission that two people were slowly, almost reluctantly, building a life's grammar together. Yet serenity is always a short guest in great houses. The nearer Phoebe came to being openly acknowledged, the more fiercely society prepared its teeth. Invitations that had once avoided her name now arrived in abundance, each heavy with ulterior weight. Gossip did not whisper any more. It sang in parlours, it slipped under doors, it coloured every glance. Some insisted she was merely a stopgap, a safe, sober experiment before the Duke's inevitable union with a titled beauty. Others declared that her very plainness was the scandal, that a duke would insult the memory of his late wife by choosing a woman whose charms were not obvious to the eye. For every step she took closer to happiness, another voice rose to remind her that she was walking on a path built of other people's disapproval. The true blow came in August, at a house party designed less for leisure than for theatre. Phoebe had agreed to attend because refusal would have been louder than presence. The grand drawing-room was a cage of gilt, mirrors, and expectation. Lady Cordelia presided like a hawk, her smile razored thin, while Caroline gamely performed at the pianoforte to an audience that scarcely cared for music. The Duke, delayed by estate business, entered later than was wise, and into that pause Cordelia poured poison disguised as wit. She spoke loudly enough for all to hear that some men, weary of beauty, sought solace in dullness, and that grief often led to unfortunate attachments made in haste. Laughter rippled, polite and cruel, and though no name was spoken, everyone's eyes betrayed their knowledge of the target. Phoebe stood very still. The weight of mockery pressed against her chest, hot and suffocating, yet she did not flee. To leave would be to confess injury. To respond would be to descend into Cordelia's arena. She did neither. Instead, when the Duke at last appeared, tall and grave in the doorway, his presence seemed to split the room. Conversation faltered. Cordelia, uncharacteristically unsettled, drew back into her chair, and Phoebe, drawing on reserves she had never known she possessed, met his eyes across the crowd and held them. The message was simple. I will not beg for rescue. I will endure, but you must choose whether to stand with me or merely near me. He crossed to her, without hesitation, ignoring the murmurs, and greeted her with the courtesy reserved for equals. That single act of alignment silenced more tongues than any speech could have. Yet when the evening closed and candles guttered, Phoebe lay awake in her chamber, hands clenched against her ribs, wondering how long even a duke's loyalty could shield her from the rot of society's contempt. For the first time she doubted, not him, but herself, her strength, her ability to weather endless storms of ridicule. And in that sleepless doubt lay the seed of her greatest trial, to learn whether love was a shelter strong enough to withstand the world's deliberate cruelty, or whether the world would grind it to dust before it had truly drawn breath. The summer did not break so much as it thinned, a silk drawn taut until the light showed through. The first tear in the fabric was almost laughably small, a misquotation tidily folded into a column that congratulated itself on knowing more than people who had actually been present. It took the Duke's remarks at the hospital gala, his practical enumeration of pumps, wages, and windows, and recast them as a sentimental performance offered to please a woman whose name it did not use. People clipped it out and placed it on mantles with the little trophies of their certainty. Phoebe read it in the library with the steadiness of someone who has been told a familiar lie and refuses to barter her memory for another person's comfort. She did not bring it to him. If he had not seen it, she would be no friend to plant it before him. If he had, he did not need her help to choose his anger. But small lies breed larger ones, and society tends its gardens with a patient malice. The house party in August, trumpeting leisure while rehearsing cruelty, was arranged by a hostess who adored the Duke with a proprietary fervour and despised being denied an audience. Phoebe accepted because to refuse would have confirmed what the city hoped, that she was ashamed of meeting its gaze. Westmoreland House sent a coach. The road unrolled through parched fields and villages that had learned to drink dust. Phoebe wore the green that believed in her, and a ribbon modest enough to pass unnoticed by a jury of eyes. She had thought herself inoculated against harm by the sheer stamina of the summer's petty torments, whispers at musicales, compliments that investigated her face for the ruin of pride, letters that proposed she educate other people's daughters as a way of cleaning her ambition. She was wrong. Cruelty, like weather, has its own season. In the gold cage of the drawing-room, among mirrors that tirelessly sold people to themselves, Lady Cordelia presided with a smile polished to a wicked grace. She moved through the room with the gliding assurance of a woman who had never yet been denied the pleasure of humiliating someone quietly. The Duke was late. Estate business, real business, muddy and stubborn, had held him. In his absence, conversation sought a target to practice on. Cordelia supplied one. "There is a fashion," she observed, arranging a lemon peel on her saucer like a dead thing. "For seriousness in men who have been bored by beauty, it is very touching to behold. They crave plainness, as penitents crave scourges. Inevitably they mistake acquaintance for absolution." The laughter that followed was not loud, which is how carefully raised laughter does its work. Nobody said Phoebe's name. Nobody needed to. She stood near a window where the light was honest to everyone and looked at a tree, and because she was not made of marble, the words found places to bruise. She did not walk away. She concentrated on the fact that her feet continued to perform their modest labor of keeping her upright. It felt like heroism and looked like nothing, which is the essence of a certain kind of courage. When he entered, the air altered. Not because a duke is a weather system by nature, but because this one refused to observe the accepted winds. His first instinct was accuracy. He went to the hostess, thanked her, allowed himself to be greeted by the people whose names he could not avoid learning, then crossed the room. The path he took was the shortest possible line that did not trample anyone's dignity. Phoebe did not move. He reached her, as if they had agreed beforehand to meet precisely there. "Miss Ashford," he said, in the tone one uses to address a partner in an enterprise worth finishing. The room punished him with a little shiver of silence, and he ignored it. "I am late." "Yes," she said, "because truth deserves company. But you have made it, and that counts for something." They spoke for perhaps 3 minutes about repairs to a tenant's roof and the expected yield of a stubborn field, ordinary as bread. It was enough to unteach the room a lesson it had been eager to refine. The hostess smiled too hard. Lady Cordelia's eyes cooled by a degree that promised winter. Caroline, across the carpet, lifted her chin in a way that meant, "I am watching you both, and I am on your side," which nearly undid Phoebe with tenderness. Later that night, alone, the steadiness spilled from her like water. She lay on a bed that had the architectural pretensions of a mausoleum and stared at a canopy while her ribs learned again how to contain breath that wanted to be a cry. She was not ashamed of her pain. She was only tired of it being so invisible that people mistook her quiet for invulnerability. The next week worked as if nothing had happened. He called at an hour hostile to theatrics and asked Sir William about an old boundary dispute whose history none of the lawyers remembered. He brought her a pamphlet from Edinburgh about a schoolroom designed to crush fewer spines and invited her to mark it with the rudeness of honesty. He told a joke that failed and refused to repair it with charm. She answered a letter from the Society while eating a cold pear and left a sticky crescent on her blotter that would later make her smile. The life they were building continued to add small rooms. Then the second tear came, not in the papers, but in the house. Sir William's old, reluctant heart decided to announce its age, subtly, yes, but in ways even the English cannot be trained to pretend not to notice. He began to grow winded on the stairs he had climbed every day of his life. He developed the habit of sitting down at the end of sentences. Phoebe, whose love had learned to show itself in practicalities, counted out his drafts, marked his good days with a discreet fold in her handkerchief, and designated the south-facing chair in the study as the only one acceptable before noon. The doctor, a man of respectable competence and suspect hair, prescribed rest and restraint, two commodities practical men never believe they can afford. Sir William agreed to both, and did neither. "I have been a father badly enough, my dear," he told Phoebe with a smile as brave as a thin plank. "Let me at least continue to be a chair you can sit in." The Duke altered his schedule, silently, without making virtue of it. He moved meetings and cancelled dinners that existed only to flatter the appetites of people who never ate. He learned to come through the door without bringing weather. He sat with Sir William in the late afternoon and asked the kind of questions that allow a man to rehearse his usefulness instead of his decline. He did not behave like a son. He behaved like a good neighbour, which is a more democratic allegiance. Phoebe loved him for that, which made everything more dangerous. London's appetite for narrative, having failed to find scandal between the covers of their quiet, began to fabricate one from older paper. A small publication with a serious name, so serious it had to be lying, ran a careful essay about the late Duchess, praising her beauty and talent for mezzotint, as if her grief had never occupied a room with them. Between the lines, it asked whether a man owes his dead any loyalty that can be measured from the far edge of a ballroom. The answer, implied with the brutish tactlessness of culture dressed as conscience, was yes, and that the measurement is made in the currency of whom he chooses next. It managed, in the same breath, to praise constancy and to condemn the only version of it a living person can practice. The dowager asked Phoebe to drive. Phoebe went with a heart that did not beat faster so much as with more direction. Lady Margaret was not a woman one could prepare answers for. She preferred honest thought over ready wit. They rode out toward the almshouses again, though the errand was pretext. "I am very old," the dowager said, as if correcting a record, "and very tired of pretending that people do not die at inconvenient times. My daughter-in-law was not an argument. She was a human creature. If people wish to turn her into a principal, I cannot stop them, but I will not allow them to place her on my table and insist I eat. Tell me, Miss Ashford, why you continue." Phoebe looked at the road, which had learned to run without needing to be praised. "Because leaving would not teach anyone the lesson they deserve. Because staying, if it is what is true, is how a person keeps a promise to herself. Because the work we began has a better chance of surviving if I refuse to permit other people's sentences to draw my map." Lady Margaret nodded, satisfied, then altered course without signalling. "And because you love him." "Yes," Phoebe said, because it was impolite to lie in a moving carriage. "And because he is good, which is rarer than kind." "Kindness is a performance anyone can learn," the dowager said. "Goodness requires the inconvenience of habit. Very well. Prepare yourself. People will begin to test you in earnest now." The test arrived at dinner one evening wearing peacock blue and the expression of a woman who expected all flocks to part when she trod. Lady Cordelia, escorted by a cousin of the hostess who adored to be in proximity with Sparks, allowed herself to be led to the seat opposite Phoebe, at a table whose centerpiece consisted of flowers enthroned like compliant courtiers. The men discussed the Reform Bill with the soothing confidence of people unconvinced that power can be pried out of a gentleman's hand by anything less than God. The women braided compliments into nets and cast them. Cordelia left her net on the table and took up a blade. "It is refreshing," she said, buttering her roll with exquisite malice, "to attend a dinner where virtue is permitted to sit at the head of the table. So many people confuse rank with appetite. How fortunate, Miss Ashford, that you have appetite for so little that is dangerous." The table shifted, some with alarm, some with curiosity. Phoebe drank water because it is difficult to speak sense while thirsty. "I try to keep my appetite educational," she said. "It spares everyone unnecessary pain." "Education," Cordelia repeated, as if tasting a foreign syllable. "Yes. I imagine you excel at teaching men that dullness can be endured if distributed in the right portions. Of course, dullness is the safest vice. The city may even learn to admire it." Phoebe set her glass down. It occurred to her that there is a point beyond which restraint becomes collaboration. She decided not to cross it tonight. "There are many safe vices," she said, gently enough that gentleness did not feel like defeat. "Some of them are served on fine china. Some of them pass as entertainment. Some of them are the habit of speaking without paying the tax of thinking. I prefer the vice of refusing to lie to myself." Cordelia laughed, radiant. "Oh, how you will suffer," she said, and for a sliver of a second the cruelty slipped, and something like pity looked out of her face, startled to have been allowed. "And perhaps how you will succeed. It depends who tires first." The Duke's hand, beside Phoebe's, was steady on the tablecloth. She saw the minute relaxation of his knuckles and loved him for not leaping to fight a battle she had chosen to fight herself. But the conversation extracted its tacks. That night, in the music room where the day's heat had gone to think, he asked her, quietly, without dramaturgy, whether she needed him to withdraw for a time, to let the city forget its new toy before returning to the game. She answered, with gratitude that felt like standing, "No." "If you go," she said, "they will call it proof. If you stay, they will call it obstinacy. We are not responsible for the verbs they choose." He kissed her hand, then in a way that made even the piano conscious of its wood. "You are the bravest person I know," he said. "Bravery is boring to narrate and difficult to watch. I am sorry." Her father grew weaker. There are arrows in a house that point toward endings, even when everyone politely looks elsewhere. It was in the way Miss Hartwell stood when Sir William entered a room, slightly turned as if ready to fetch, in the way Blackwood's steps recalibrated to the measure of a man who could be depended upon to need less sound, in the way Lady Victoria's voice softened on his name to disguise an old habit of sharpness. The Duke began taking tea at Ravenscroft as if it were a matter of Westmoreland policy. When the doctor spoke of rest, he translated it into assignments. "Sir William, I need your opinion on whether we should lay the school floor in oak or stone, because the overseer and I have discovered we possess equal portions of stubbornness and cannot resolve it without a chairman." "I am of no use to anyone," Sir William muttered, and then, because usefulness is a drug difficult to wean from, "Oak, boy. Stone chills the bones 10 months of the year in the north. Ask any widow." They walked together in the garden one late afternoon when the air had decided to be kind. Sir William leaned on the Duke's arm without apology. The chestnut, faithful witness made the quiet music of leaves. "You love my daughter," Sir William said, "because dying makes a man impatient with euphemism." "Yes," the Duke said, "because living makes a man answer." "She is clever enough to be miserable," Sir William went on, turning his breath into sentences with care. "Promise me you will not require her to be obvious. That is the only promise I ask." "I would not know how," the Duke said, smiling, and Sir William, satisfied, allowed himself to be precious for a moment and patted the arm of a duke as if he were a dog who had done a good trick. The fall arrived with a virus in its pocket. Cholera did not care for schedules nor for reputations. It liked drains and crowds and nights after rain, and it selected its victims with a contempt for rank that would have made a radical proud. In the northern villages, Phoebe had walked with the Duke. A handful of cases grew a second hand. The letters from his steward, usually smug with barley, arrived nervous with mortality. He looked at the maps he had spread on the library table and said, "I must go," in the voice of a man about to enter a room he will not describe for a long while after he leaves it. "Come with me," he added, because habit had become affection, had become partnership. "I will not be a duchess walking through plague for novelty," she said, "but I will be the woman who knows the names of the nurses and can teach the children to boil water when the men are at the pit." She packed, as a woman does when she means to be useful, linen, vinegar, Needles, a book that teaches more before breakfast than a roomful of men after luncheon. Lady Victoria, who had learned a new language late, how to say stay and mean go and say go and mean God keep you, kissed her daughter's forehead and said, "Wear the plainest coat we own. Let your kindness be the thing they remember." They went. The estates were sick, and sickness is a frank tutor. Phoebe learned again the economy of fear, how to spend it in small coins that purchase attention rather than in paper notes that buy panic. She scrubbed boards and aired sheets and argued with men who preferred whiskey to water because the former had the decency to announce its deceit. She stood in doorways where breath and hope both were in short supply and said the names of children loudly enough to teach their bodies to keep answering. The Duke worked until his hands accepted blisters willingly. He paid for doctors the district would have delayed for a week, bullied the pump handle until it was ashamed of its sulks, and buried, with the vicar, a child whose mother had no strength left to cry. At night they spoke in the low, practical tones of people who must not wake the worst possibilities. In the mornings they went out and earned the right to sleep again. It was there, in the middle of usefulness, that the third tier cut across the cloth. A letter arrived at Ravenscroft with the sort of slanted hand that suggests a writer in love with her own gall. It accused Phoebe of cruelty in the language of virtue. It suggested that a woman who entered a plague district with a duke did so for the pleasure of being admired for her courage rather than to exercise it. That a lady who stood in a poor kitchen teaching a small girl to boil water did so because she understood the theatre of steam. It arrived on a day when Sir William had been too tired to raise his head for lunch, and Lady Victoria had received back a bouquet she had sent to a woman whose daughter was engaged to a man considered too near the new scandal to warrant celebration. Miss Hartwell brought the letter upstairs and did not give it to Phoebe. She took it to the fire because sometimes the kindest course is to deny a sentence the opportunity to wound. Phoebe did not read it, but she felt the new cold in the house that evening when she returned from the north. People had learned to say her name like a question. Sir William died 2 weeks later at home, where the pictures had known him since he could be lifted by one hand. He went as decent men go, apologetically, with a misplaced courtesy, breaking his daughter's heart with the smallness of the trouble he tried to make. The house bent its head. Blackwood closed doors in a rhythm that was not sadness exactly, but the etiquette sadness requires. Lady Victoria sat very straight and forgot where cups go. Caroline played scales softly through the wall, teaching her fingers a grief they had not rehearsed. The Duke came and did not lead, he followed. Phoebe did not weep in the first 2 days, because the body sometimes protects the soul by refusing to perform on command. She wrote notes that told the truth without flourishes. She held her mother's wrist when the pulse ran like a frightened rabbit. She slept between the hours on a chair with the tranquil posture of the dead and the dreams of the drowning. At the funeral, the city announced its appetite. The church was full, as churches are when a decent man has lived a long time in one place and borrowed little he did not return. Outside, the press, those who sell oranges in sentences, clustered like crows. They were held back by Blackwood's gaze and Edmund's baritone and the laws of England, but their presence wrote its own homily. After, in the small room with the sherry that no one ever likes, the dowager set a hand on Phoebe's shoulder, as if to say, "You will stand, because you have stood before." Lady Cordelia, who never missed the opportunity to dress her curiosity as compassion, approached with a solemnity that fit her like a borrowed cloak. "I am sorry," she said, and for once she meant it. Loss disarms even the well-armed. Then, because habit is stronger than pity, she added, "This changes everything, of course." "No," Phoebe said, and discovered in her mouth a voice she had not used before, one that belonged to a woman who had learned to answer the world in declarative sentences. "This changes nothing that mattered, and everything that didn't." The fourth tear came precisely where one expected it, and precisely where Phoebe had promised herself she would not break. Inside a rumour dressed as concern. The Duke had gone north again, because duty does not ask permission, and a report came back, hastily carried by a cousin with the tranquil malice of a man who enjoys witnessing other people's weather. He claimed the Duke had been seen walking with Lady Cordelia in a garden at dusk. Heads inclined, the language of confidences unmistakable. He did not add the piece that made the sentence honest, that the garden belonged to a house in which a committee had met to allocate emergency funds, that the dusk had been wedged between 2 hours of public generosity, that the Duke's head inclines when anyone speaks to him because he refuses the theatre of being above a conversation. The cousin presented the rumour to Lady Victoria with the bored authority of a man who knows he will be believed because he has practised being credible in mirrors. Lady Victoria told herself she did not entirely believe him, and then proceeded to behave as if she did, which is a common tragedy, and the seed of many more. Phoebe heard it not from her mother, but from Caroline, who arrived white as a new sheet, and then blushed for the crime of having borne bad news. "Tell me," Phoebe said, and listened, and at the end of the cousin's careful sentence she said the words that felt like stepping into a river that had been calling for years. "I will ask him." Then she waited, because there are questions one must not ask in a letter. They belong in the room where answers can bring their full weight. He returned on the third day, mud on his boots and sleep in his face, and the first thing he did was look for her. He found her where she prefers to be found, on the boundary between private and public, in the library with the door ajar. She did not raise her voice. "They say," she said, "that you walked in the dusk with a woman who has decided to be my enemy." He answered with the speed of a man who has trained himself not to be rescued by delay. "I walked with Lady Cordelia because she chairs a committee that controls a purse I need to pry open. I disliked every minute of it, and I will do it again if the money moves at the end. I am not proud. I am not careless. I am asking you to believe me when I tell you there is no other currency being traded." She had prepared several versions of anger, each neatly folded, sensible as linen, none fit. What came out was the tiredness of a person who has been holding a roof on with her hands. "I do believe you," she said. "That is the stupid part. I do. And yet I find that I cannot quite stand tonight in every direction at once. I cannot be brave for the city, brave for the house, brave for my mother, brave for my sister, and brave for a rumour I did not invite. I am momentarily small." He crossed to her then and did the one thing she needed, which was not to touch her without permission. "Then be small," he said, like a blessing. "Let me be tall for a while. There is no honour in sharing a weight that can be carried by one back today." It might have mended then, it might have mended entirely, if not for the letter that arrived the next morning in a hand she knew and did not recognize. The Dowager asked to see her alone. In the formal parlour at Westmoreland House, under portraits that had learned the art of silent judgment, Lady Margaret poured tea that would not remember being drunk. "We are nearly at the place where we must name things," she said without ceremony. "I have wished for that day. I am not a coward, but I must ask you a question I would prefer never to ask another woman." "Ask it," Phoebe said, grateful to know the price ahead of time. "If my son asks for your hand," the dowager said, "will you say yes, knowing that there will be years, perhaps many, in which you will not be believed by the city, not trusted by the women who should be your allies, and not forgiven by the ghosts people prefer to love than the living? I will not allow him to propose into a kindness he cannot keep." Phoebe thought of the pump at Bracken Row, and the elm whose roots would drink in a way the drain could not insult, of the small boy, Tom, who would, in 2 years, outgrow every spade that village could lend him, of Caroline's hand on a child's wrist, teaching the honest tyranny of time in scales, of her father's trust, tucked into her like a letter she would not mislay. She thought of the room in the charity hall where the Duke had asked her permission to be seen wanting something. She thought of the garden where a rumour had planted itself, and the library where it had come to die. She thought of Cordelia's laughter, bright as broken glass, and of Lady Margaret's tired valour. She thought of the word when, whispered to a rose, and of the year that had taught her to live inside it. "Yes," she said, "because sometimes love is a decision made in full daylight. And there will be days I will forget why. And you must, if you love him, permit me to forget, and permit me to remember without penalty." The dowager's eyes filled in the honourable, unflattering way of people who do not practice tears. "Then perhaps the house will be in good hands." She set down her cup with the ceremony of a woman concluding a chapter, and then remembered the cruelty the world requires of women who would protect what they love. "I will warn you of one more thing, and then I will help you. Cordelia will not forgive you." "Forgive her anyway, or she will make you clever where you should be kind." "I will try," Phoebe said, and knew already how often she would fail, and how much she would work to fail less. Outside, the day was hiding itself in cloud. Inside, the house made small, precise noises of readiness, like a soldier checking buckles. When the Duke arrived that evening, there was no grand scene. He entered a room, and it held. He sat, and the chair did not object. He looked at Phoebe with a steadiness that made the future decide it could be made. He spoke, without flourishes, without angels panting, of marriage as if he spoke of a bridge, how it must be built, what it must carry, how much weight it must be prepared to bear without cracking, and how beautiful a structure can be when designed to be walked on daily. She listened and heard, under the plans and the honesty and the necessary jokes, the one note that matters in houses and in hearts, the refusal to lie. The world would not congratulate them for that. It would be very bored by it. She counted that boredom as her first dowry and accepted it gladly.